Okay, good morning and welcome everybody to FotoVideo Norway. My name is Brian Worley. I'm a, should we say, freelance trainer, presenter. Some people said the Canon EOS guru. And this morning I've been asked to come here and tell you something about Speedlight Flash. Hopefully we're going to tell you how the system really works, try and dispel some of the myths and the lots of strange things you see on the internet, not all of it true. Nowadays, like I said, I'm a freelance trainer and presenter. I also do some photography, and at the moment I've just been writing a book. So lots to do and an interesting life 1 year on from working for Canon. Today I'd like to say that we're fortunately live casting to the internet, so there may be a few more people watching us. So if you ask me questions, then I'll probably try and repeat it just so everybody can catch those. And also, please make sure mobile phones and things are switched off. But if you do have questions as we're going through, please raise your hands. Don't just hold back to the end, and we'll try and hit exactly an hour. And that'll be good. One or two more. Okay, let's start on. So, regardless of whether you put your flash on the camera, off the camera, you have more than one or two, there's some basics which we need to get through. We need to talk about the Canon flash exposure. So how does ETTL2 actually work? What does it do to the pictures? I'm also going to talk about using more than one speedlight. Okay, so we're talking about multiple speedlights, and I give you a few real-world examples. Something where you can see how you might take your knowledge that you'll gain in the next hour or so and turn that into real-world pictures. Okay, let's look at the beginning. First of all, let's talk about which speedlights and which cameras. We'll talk of that. Then I want to explain something about ETTL2. So how does the flash system actually work? I'd also like to talk something which most people aren't aware of, which is which shooting mode. So if you're in program, TV, AV modes, how the Canon flash system works is different. I'm also going to talk about metering, because lots of people are very confused with this part about how they set a metering pattern and what's the impact on their flash photography. And I will mention things about exposure and flash lock. So first thing is to quickly remind us of the flashes we're talking about. So this is the current family of speedlight flashes, ranging from the 270EX Mark II, the 320EX, the 430EX Mark II, and actually the 580EX Mark II. Good morning. There are older versions of flashes. So the simple answer is, if you have a flash that says EX on the end, whether it's a 580EX, 550EX, 380EX even, it all works with the flash system. So there's a lot of compatibility. The other thing is that the flash system and the way we're going to talk about is something called ETTL2, or what Canon calls ETTL2. That one is depending on the camera, not the flash. So if you've got an older flash and you think, well, this doesn't apply, actual fact it does apply because it depends on your camera. So the important thing actually is not perhaps ETTL2 flashes, but ETTL2 cameras. When Canon introduced the EOS 20D and the 1D Mark II, they brought out this new ETTL2 flash system. And the idea was that they wanted to improve the results that people got with flash, because there was quite a lot of valid feedback that the system didn't deliver what people expected. So if you're still using a 10D, an EOS 10D, maybe it's time to think about an upgrade. But basically remember that the camera determines your flash control. So that's why all the old EX model flash guns work with the newest flash metering. So the reason that they changed the flash metering was they wanted to deliver accurate flash exposures, pretty much independent of the AF point. So in the old system, when you move the AF point in your camera viewfinder, so if you change which focus point, or you're using automatic AF points and the camera's selected one over here, that's where the center of your exposure metering was done for flash. The problem is lots of people take a picture, they focus, they lock the focus, and then they recompose, and suddenly they've moved their center of their flash exposure off their subject, pointing it at a totally different background, and the flash fired and it gave them a random result. Actual fact, the flash is trying to expose for where the AF point is now pointing, because the flash calculation is done right when the picture is taken. So what they did was they said, let's not use the AF points as the sole way to find out where the subject is. What they brought in was a way of finding the subject in the frame by using a pre-flash. The other thing was that they found that if you had really reflective things, like you had a mirror in the background, it would reflect the light back at the camera and confuse the camera. So they said, if you see something where the light comes really strongly back, the flash metering and the system tends to ignore that. So you might get bright hot spots in the back because it says they're not really to be measured as part of the exposure. But probably the key thing is to remember for everybody that actually the flash meters only when the picture is taken, unless you use something called flash exposure lock, which we'll touch on in the future. So it's important to remember, if you do use focus lock and recompose a lot, so if you're in one shot mode for that focus, move, you might want to think this ETTL2 is going to help you. In the old systems it wouldn't. There is a couple of things to remember. They also put into the system lens distance information. So for a long time, a lot of, pretty much all of the USM lenses have been reporting, or had the function to report back to the camera, the distance that they're focused at. So if the subject is 3 meters away, the lens can tell the camera, I'm focused at 3 meters. Now lens distance information works really well, provided your flash, or the camera thinks it, is pretty much sat on top of your hot shoe. If you bounce the flash, this will switch off lens distance information, because the lens says it's 3 meters away, but the flash has got to travel 2 meters up, 2 meters down. So that doesn't make any sense. Because if the camera knows the distance and knows this is pointing at the subject, then actually the lens distance information gives it another help. It's not solely using it, but it gives it another help in actually getting a good flash exposure, because it knows the power of the flash. Like I said, pretty much every lens that says USM in its name gives you flash distance information, and a lot more of the later EFS lenses also. One tip is, if you do use one of these off-camera cords, which give you full dedication, so this, as far as the camera is concerned right now, my flash is sat on top of the camera. If I took it off and I put my flash and stretched this, let's just do it quickly. So if I stretch the flash away, or change how I'm going to hold it, so that I do this, or I bounce it, then actually what happens now is the camera is still thinking, and I've done that and I'm quite close to my subject. The camera thinks, and the lens distance information tells it, okay, it's 3 meters away, but actually, in fact, I've moved my flash a meter closer. This will confuse it. If you're going to do that, my tip, bounce the head. Now, because you've bounced it, the camera has been told by the flash head is bounced, ignore the distance information. So it will start dealing just with its own measurements. Now the key thing with the Canon system is they try to be quite subtle with their flash exposures. They try to fill in. Some people say it is too subtle. They want more power in their flash exposures. They want to see more existence of the flash. We'll talk about that in a little bit, how you can achieve that. But that is the important. Basically, Canon tries to do quite a very neutral balance, so that you don't see flash a little bit stronger than daylight. Some of the other systems take a slightly different approach. The other thing is very important is the shooting mode. Determines how the system is going to work with flash and daylight exposures. Because with in ETTL, the flash is always calculated automatically unless you put the flash into manual. So what happens is that you've got your camera in manual. This is a common one. People come to me and they say, I'll put the system in manual, camera's in M, and my flash is still changing. Why? Well, because you haven't put the flash in manual. You've just told the camera to be in manual. Now, depending on which mode you're shooting in, whether you're shooting in, if you shoot in program mode, this is the one that causes probably some of the most problems. Because in program mode, if the camera sees a flash, what it does is it will actually change its range of shutter speeds. So in program mode with a flash on the camera will only work between 1/60th of a second and the sync speed of your camera, so a 250th, 200th maybe, depending on the camera, 300th on a Mark IV and a DX. So you have to think that program mode is working great if you're shooting outdoors and then you go indoors. Your pictures will change in their appearance. Outdoors, it may be that the shutter speeds for the daylight part is matching with the aperture, and so you've got a nice correctly exposed background, the flash fires and it lights your subjects. You go indoors, suddenly the camera says it's too dark in here, but I'm only going to choose a 60th of a second. So all your flash pictures will change. The backgrounds will go dark and your subject lit by flash will look a little bit brighter comparatively because the background is dark, but actually they're the same exposure. If you put the camera in aperture priority, AV, or shutter priority, TV, then actually the camera now has the free range of all of the shutter speeds and all of the apertures. So particularly in aperture priority, if you're shooting outside, it might choose a 200th of a second to give you the correct ambient light. You go indoors and suddenly it gives you a half-second exposure because it's trying to bring the ambient light up. It's trying to let the light in to record that correctly. In terms of manual, you're determining it. If you put the camera in manual, you're determining how the ambient light is recorded. Let me try and show you that in pictures. Here's two images. The far one is taken in program mode. Okay, the one across the far side. The one here closest to me with the bluer background is taken in aperture priority. Same subject, seconds apart, same flash. The far one is taken at 1/60th of a second at f2.8. This one is still at f2.8, but it's 1/3 of a second. It's because the camera is trying to get some light into the desert scene that's actually behind the model. On the far one in program mode, the camera says 1/60 is as fast as I can go. There's no way that I'm going to give up on the background. So this is the balanced version, and the far one is what I'm calling flash dominant because the camera has given up. So if you're in program mode, depending on how bright the background is, your pictures will switch between these different types without really you having any control. If you want to control how bright or dark the background is that's not lit by your flash, you need to be working in aperture priority or manual. Actual fact, if you're just starting photography, the night portrait mode on some of the things like the 600D, they do a really good job with this. but just watch the shutter speeds. They'll start to fall quite a lot, particularly in the dark. I recently got caught out in a training, a one-to-one training I did for somebody with this one. There is a way in the system to configure how the cameras work with a flash when you're in aperture priority. And the reason I got almost caught with this was that the lady I was teaching had set this function to give her this, a 200th of a second. We were trying to shoot wide aperture portraits in bright daylight, and we're trying to use high-speed sync. This will also switch off high-speed sync, so you can't work it, but only in aperture priority. So, looking at this, what happens is the default is auto. If you're in aperture priority, your shutter speed can be 30 seconds. I'm usually pretty good at hand-holding cameras, but even I struggle holding a camera still for 30 seconds while the shutter's open. If you choose this one, effectively you've turned aperture priority into program mode, because it's got the same range, 1/60th of a second to a 200th. Okay, and that's done for a reason that pretty much 60th of a second you should be able to hand hold with a reasonable lens on when you're using a flash. So it's to avoid camera shake. Or this one, you've now turned the camera into, you've turned AV mode into manual and locked the shutter speed, which says, actual fact, I don't care what the background looks like, just give me the flash sync speed. This is out of a 5D Mark II. And why is that important? Let's look at this. Here we've got a scene where this is just ambient light. Set up in a room, you've got a toy figure, and all I'm adjusting is exposure compensation. Not flash exposure compensation, but exposure compensation. This is your typical subject. You've got something stood, back a window light behind it, so the camera sees all these bright things, typically will underexpose the actual figure. It's the kind of situation where you might want to use a flash. And so by changing the brightness of the background, all of this is effectively lit by whatever's coming through that window. We can just turn the exposure compensation up or down. So that gives us control over how bright the rest of the picture is that's not lit by flash. So the ambient part. We also have on the system flash exposure compensation. By changing flash exposure compensation, we can change the brightness of the flash lit bits. So Tigger here is what's lit by the flash. In actual fact, all of these pictures are taken with the same shutter speed and the same aperture on this page. So the ambient light doesn't change. But since only the figure is lit by the flash, that's the bit that the flash exposure compensation is changing. Okay, so here, and the reason this one looks brighter on the background is actually I'm now putting out so much light from the flash, it's actually bouncing off the walls in the room and also starting to put some light onto that curtain in the background. But by having the two controls for flash exposure compensation and for the ambient, the regular exposure compensation, you can control or change the balance of how your flash pictures look when it's running in automatic. Now, given that that's correct exposure, I think in this case it's a little bit dark. So you might need to think, okay, I'd like to go to something like this. Again, this is, to me, is a little bit over the +2. But these are the things you need to work with. It's trying to do a balance. Your metering patterns. So you've all seen these kind of symbols on the cameras, I guess, for spot metering, partial metering, center weighted, and evaluative. Everyone says, oh, I put the metering in spot and everything's good. It's actually often the cause of a lot of problems for some photographers. However, changing the metering pattern only changes the ambient metering pattern. The flash is still evaluating the whole frame. So all you're doing is changing how the camera is measuring that daylight. But also remember, if you're using partial spot or center weighted, and you press the shutter halfway, if you move your camera, there is no automatic lock of that ambient exposure. You only get an automatic lock when you use the evaluative metering. So if you recompose your picture and now point your spot meter at something that's much brighter, your whole picture for the ambient part is going to be underexposed. There is a way to change the flash metering program. So there's usually a custom function or something in the flash menus for your cameras where you can switch it between evaluative and average. When it's in evaluative, what happens is that the flash goes off as what they call a pre-flash. It lights the subject and the camera has got a view of what the subject looks like without the flash. So because its numbers are different segments around the frame, it can identify which bit of the frame is lit by flash. And it then uses those segments around that piece of the subject to say that's the bit we care about for flash metering, the rest is all to do with ambient. If you change this setting, it basically means that everything in the picture should be lit by flash and everything in the picture has an average similar balance. Okay? This can work. Some people I know use this if they're working indoors where they're working on close-up work or things like this. Average quite often works because you're lighting the whole frame. But if you're trying to balance ambient light and flash in say portraits outside, keep it on evaluative. It's much more consistent and will give you much better results. Okay, we said that exposure lock, you half press the button, you're in standard evaluative metering and you have an exposure lock. You probably, if you're using a 5D or something like that, you have the star button on the back. You can also lock the exposure with the star button. When you press that star button, if you've got a flash on top, you will see the flash will also fire, because that star button has dual duty or double duty. It does an ambient exposure lock and it also locks the flash exposure. But in order to do that, the camera needs to know what the flash exposure is. So you press the star button, it will fire the pre-flash and measure the subject based on that pre-flash. It's nice to know it's there. Some of the cameras, 7Ds, 1 Series, have a dedicated button or a programmable button which you can configure for flash exposure lock specifically, which means you've got a button for flash lock and a button for ambient lock. And if you're seriously into your flash, these are good things to have. If you're using manual mode, effectively the star on the back of a 5D is only flash exposure lock. I also seen the situation that some people react very fast to the pre-flash and they close their eyes. So the pre-flash fires, they close their eyes, and then very quickly after the main flash exposure happens, they've still got their eyes closed. If you press the flash exposure lock buttons, you fire the pre-flash and you count to 2 in your head and then take the picture, because by now their eyes have opened again and so they won't be blinking in the picture, and it works pretty much every time. Okay, let's talk about bit more about pictures. We've seen some of the technical things. It's important to get through the pictures. So I'm going to talk a little bit about white balance, this strange thing called auto lighting optimizer, because this has an effect, and I'm also going to talk about high-speed sync. Actually, in fact, the picture over here is an example of automatic flash for you. So it's shot in aperture priority mode. I'm choosing my aperture I want for the picture. It's in the winter time in the UK, and he's lit by flash. Actual fact, he's lit by a slightly orange flash, which is why I've made the background go a little bit bluer. It usually looks more grey in the UK. But it is a thing about the white balance. So when you're using your flash, the flash is basically tuned to give you a colour of light that's pretty close to normal daylight. So if your camera is in automatic white balance, the flash and the camera will communicate and try and give you balanced, accurate colours. If your camera is set for flash white balance, the same thing happens. However, if your daylight is different colour, the daylight part will be differently lit to your flash part. So if your daylight is early morning daylight or late evening daylight, it will have a different tone. And it's quite important. The thing is that the flashes change their colour temperature a little bit as their power changes. Not by much, but change a little bit. And so they actually send back to the camera information about how much power they're going to give, which enables the camera to make a better white balance calculation. If you're going to use these stick-on gels to cover over the front of your flash to give you some tone, I would suggest you put your cameras in Kelvin white balance, so set a specific white balance. Because otherwise, the camera tries to analyse all over the frame and work out the best white balance, not for the whole frame, but all over the frame. So it's trying to see, this bit could be a little bit blue, this could be a bit orange, and it will correct. So you'll get some strange results. If you set it for Kelvin, the camera treats the whole frame as the same colour from a white balance point of view. So if I'm using one of these gels on my flash, almost without doubt, stick that on the flash and put the camera in Kelvin white balance. Can't see it on this projector. Should have got a Z'd. Auto lighting optimizer. Auto lighting optimizer is on by default in virtually all the modern cameras. An auto lighting optimizer, when you're using it with a camera with a flash on it, says if the flash exposure is a bit dark, the bit that's lit by flash, so in this case I've got my model is lit a little bit by flash from above, we'll see in a minute, then it will try, if it thinks the flash has not had enough power to light the model, to actually boost it. But it also can adapt the background. And so what I see on the screens here is that, actual fact, this floor is darker, which is what I wanted it to be, than it is in this picture. Because the camera has seen that's too dark and has automatically boosted the brightness to try and give me a better picture. It is one of those things. So the point to remember is, even in manual mode, if you put your camera in manual, but certainly on a 60D, 7D, a 1D Mark IV, auto lighting optimizer still works. Other cameras in the past, like a 5D2, it doesn't work in manual mode. So you put camera in manual, you switch off auto lighting optimizer. But on a 1D4, 60D, 7Ds, it's still switched on. So depending which camera you've got, have a look at what auto lighting optimizer might be trying to correct something that you're trying to achieve. Okay, high-speed sync. It says, why has he put a picture up of a G series camera? Well, you might have noticed they have a hot shoe on top. The great thing about G series cameras is they don't have focal plane shutters. So actually, if you need to work with really high shutter speeds with your flash, a G series camera works really well. works with all the flash system, and you can use 1/1000 of a second shutter speeds with flash. It's a neat trick. It's perhaps change your camera rather than play with the things. It also means your flash power stays up. Alternatively, put your flash in high-speed sync mode. Let's imagine you're working in daylight. You want to take some nice portraits. It's bright sunshine like we've got out here today in Oslo, and you want to work at f2. But actually the camera says, well, at f2 out there, even at ISO 100, I'm going to need a 500th of a second to get a good ambient exposure. If you've got high-speed sync switched on, the camera can quite happily choose in AV mode a 500th of a second, and your flash will still work. So then you get a good balance. You get the correct exposure for the background of your subject, and the flash exposure is correct on the face of your subject. If you don't switch it on, you'd have the situation where the background suddenly looks really, really bright. And some people say it then starts to make the flashlit person look a bit dark, because comparatively the background is too bright. There is no real downside to leaving it switched on. If you're working at that point where your shutter speed might drift over your sync speed, so it might go above a 250th of a second, effectively the camera has got a bit more flexibility. It can work at 125th, and then it will just run normal flash, but if it goes to a 500th, it'll switch automatically and use the high-speed sync. So leaving it on is quite useful. However, with high-speed sync, you will see a reduction in the power that's available from your flash. Okay? So that's perhaps the downside, is if you use high-speed sync, there's a power reduction. Is there a question?
Yeah, I'm sorry. Will it also work for offshoot flash?
Yes, it will work for offshoot. So the question is, can you use high-speed sync with offshoot flash? Yes, you can. And also, depending on which flash or which camera you have as a master, you can also use it with the wireless system. So as long as you set it in the master, it can inform the slaves, depending on the slaves, that they should also work in high speed. Okay, there's another question.
Does it also work in manual mode?
So yes, the question is, can you use a high-speed sync in manual mode? And yes, you can. Manual on the camera and manual on the flash.
Program?
Yes, it works, but obviously within program, pretty much the shutter speed range is constrained automatically to within the 60th to the flash sync speed. Okay. Here's where it gets a little bit busy. What about using more than one flash? Or what about making your flash work away from the camera? Quite naturally, or quite obviously, probably one of the least useful places to put a flash, in some ways, is right on top of your camera. The light is really flat. It's not the best place to put a flash from a good photography point of view, a nice looking picture. There's not many other places on a camera you could put one. If you were going to design a camera, it's pretty much going to be somewhere a similar kind of distance away from the lens. So it's a good compromise place, but it's not the best place. But if you can move the flash and get it away from the camera somewhere, you can start to create shadow. And the shadow gives depth to your pictures. There are ways of taking the flash off the camera. Put some of these down. Probably the inexpensive, or the first step is using one of these off-camera cords. At this point, you've got everything that the flash would have if it was sat on top of the camera is still working. So it performs exactly the same way. Even on the camera, if you use the flash menus, So as far as the camera is concerned, I've got full control of this flash because I've got this cable which the camera is thinking the cable doesn't exist. The next step is to perhaps go and say, what about if we took the flash away, let's pick one up, and on 7Ds, 60Ds, 600Ds, we can control these from the pop-up flash. So this will talk to this. And it will control them, so you make the settings here, and this responds. I'll talk about where you need to place it. That's a neat trick. But if you don't have one of these 60Ds, 7Ds or 600Ds, putting so-called a master onto your camera like this. Now you can use this one solely to control all the other flashes. Everyone says, but it still fires even if I tell it not to. And this is the important thing. The Canon system, and in fact all the systems out there right now, use pulses of visible light. Everyone says, it's infrared, I can see these red lights flashing. If you can see them flashing, why don't you see the flashes from the end of your TV remote, which also uses infrared? Everyone says it's infrared. It is not infrared. It's visible light, so it comes from the flash tube. It's not to do with this. This is a kind of visible indicator that it's in slave mode, but it's also used to send AF information. It projects a pattern onto your subjects to help the camera see in the dark and get better focus. These panels, they have a use in terms of the slaves. This is where they receive the information from your master. So it's important that they point back to the master. We also have, once we start bringing more than one extra flash, we have the opportunity to do ratio control. We can control the balance between a left side and maybe a right side flash. Let's just take something simple. If you imagine in the middle, the center one, this is our master flash. Okay? The Canon system has 3 groups of flashes. Not just 3 flashes, but 3 groups. A, B and C. The far image, the one on the left hand side of the slide, shows a slave in group A. It's a 420X, Mark II. And this one shows a slave in group B. How these two are controlled by the master depends on the choice of the ratio control. Now, on previous generations of flashes, before the Mark II flashes came along, you'd have to learn the dance of all the buttons on the back of the flash to get through all these settings. The best thing about the modern cameras and the Mark II flashes is that it's displayed in Norwegian on the back of your camera, and you can make all the settings from the camera. Okay? So I know of people who used to walk around with the instruction manual to work out which sequence of buttons to press. Now they just read the text on the camera. It's made life much, much easier. I'll also indicate one thing about this picture that's possibly different to what you may see on your flashes. Channels up here and here. By default, when you get a flash and you open it and you put batteries in it, they're set to channel 1. I don't use channel 1. This is my top tip. Everyone else that buys a flash in the store today takes it home and uses it on channel 1. If you're out taking pictures and your flash is on channel 1, they can also use your flashes, because it will just respond to everything on channel 1. I use channel 2, because the guys that just bought a very basic simple flash and didn't read the book haven't learnt to change the channel. Okay, so you can then control your flashes and they're not flattening your batteries. My tip is channel 2 is much better than channel 1. There are 4 channels available if you've got a friend who also likes channel 2. Now, we've seen A and B channels, but Canon labels them in the menus, in your camera menus. And so it's time for a little bit of maths, because how you select the ratios or not changes how the flash works. Let's imagine we have a master, I'll call him this one. He's going to control these flashes. Let's say this 580 is A and this 430 is B. Alright, when you don't enable ratio control but both exist and one's A and one's B, this will say to them both, please fire some pre-flash. They both give out an amount of power. The camera looks at the light, looks at the ambient, looks at the flash, and says, okay, I need you all to give me half power for the actual picture. So they all give half power. That's all well and good if these are basically in the same place, pointing in the same way, trying to give you the same effect on your picture. But if you're trying to light someone and you move your other flash over to one side, there's now some distance between these, and you point this one this way at your model. They're doing different jobs. And that's where, using the A to B ratio, you, from the camera, tell the flash system what you want to do with the different flashes. So what happens is when the pre-flash fires, it fires a few times. You get, the camera says, all of you A group flashes, give me some pre-flash. And it measures the A group. It then says, all of the B group flashes, please give me some pre-flash. And it measures that one. So it now sees what's lit by A, what's lit by B, and it can control the balance between the two. Now that's important if your subject moves. If I put this flash and I put it over here, and I've got a person who stood right in the middle between them, they both gave me the same power, it would be fine. I'm trying to get the same balance. If the person moves to their left, or they move to their right, my right, they've changed their distance from the flash. So the flash powers would need to change. And if you're not in this A-B ratio, the flash powers will be the same. So you'll suddenly get that one side of their face will be overexposed and one will be under. You do it with this and it will still keep the balance for you automatically. There is a third option, A to B and C. With this one, your flash does the same A-B thing, but then Group C's power is adjusted, and in Canon speak, Group C is considered as a backlight. So if you're working, say, on small things in a tabletop studio, this is what it thinks, so it's trying to determine how bright or dark the background is. If you go crazy and put your flash in manual, you can control the power levels of each of the groups by but this is only available in manual flash. Anybody know how many flashes you can put in a group? 7, okay, that's good. Okay, so the answer is as many as can see the master, because they're not actually sending anything back, they just do what they're told. So as long as they can see the light from the master, you can have as many as you like. It's only limited by how big your wallet is Okay? And can they see the master? So if you can stack 25 flash guns on the table, not quite there yet, put them all in the same group, they'll all work as one big powerful light. So it doesn't matter how many. Most people think 7's about the limit based on the size of their wallet. And also, you start arranging 7 lights around something, you need to have some option for them to see the light from the master. By playing with A and B ratios, we can do interesting things to pictures. If you imagine I had 2 flashes for this picture. One is above and one is below my subject on the slides. By changing the balance between one at A and one at B from the camera, I can change the look of my pictures quite dramatically. And whereas you might think, well, I'd want them to eat about the same, that might be the case, but by having that, putting one up as A and one as B gives you this flexibility when you're in that ratio mode. If we had a group C, we can say, oh, I want the background. This is a white wall, but I've made it grey because I've told it to turn down the power on the background. So I've made it grey. But he's lit, you can see there's 2 catch lights in his eyes. Again, one from below, one from above, slightly off to one side. When it gets a little bit more interesting, you can do things. So at this point, I'm actually using 4 flash guns. I have 2 actually stacked up in an umbrella just in front of the model. I've got 1 on the background, and I'm actually using another one just on the top as a hair light. So this is done by using A and B on my model, and I've got a C again on the background. If you are going to use manual on your flashes, okay, you can do it. The most important thing to remember is put your slaves in automatic. So if you see the word ETTL on a slave, like this one's showing, let's make it a slave. So it's now a slave. It's in automatic. If it gets a command from either the camera, which is a master, or a master flash, I want you to be in manual, this will switch to manual mode. Okay? So you leave this. I always tend to leave the slaves in automatic, in ETTL, because when I need it, because that way, if I'm working with manual flash, put the master in manual, send the power levels, and then I can quickly put it master back in automatic, and have the flash controlled automatically. If you put a slave in manual mode, do that one. You have to press and hold the buttons. Okay, you can now set the power of your slave. It is no longer in a particular flash group. So if you've got a really complicated lighting and you want about half power from over there and full power from in front and quarter power from over there, and you want 2 lots of full power on the background, put all of the slaves in manual and have them just fire as per your requirements. But you then cannot put them back into automatic from a master flash. You have to go round to each individual slave and put it back into automatic. So I tend to put leave my slaves in ETTL and have them all the control from the master. The key with anything, because everyone says it doesn't work in daylight. When you go outside, flash doesn't work. It works better if this can see the light from this. Okay, so make use of the fact that the heads swivel. Point this bit back at your camera, point this bit at what you're trying to light. Because if you don't, and you've got this outside some meters away and it's pointing like that, and you're working from behind, this can't see what's going on. It doesn't get any signals, so it won't fire. You do that, and it will work. The other important thing actually is when you put a slave or a master into, or you put a flash into slave or master mode, the head on the flash zooms. And it zooms to 24mm, a good wide spread of light. On a master, that's because it thinks, well, I might have to, all the slaves need to be able to see what's going on. They could be spread over a big wide area, so we need a wide spread of light. If you've only got one slave, and it's a long way away over there, go to the flash, your master, set the zoom, and zoom the beam to 105mm. It will go further. And you know that it's got to be pointed over there. Yes, there's a question.
Will a master flash be more powerful outside than the pop-up flash?
These typically, yes, typically these are more reliable as masters outside as than the pop-up flashes. One thing that confuses people is if you've got a pop-up flash on a camera and you do that and your flash is over there, you've already got something that's in the way, reducing the light reaching it. And these don't have quite the same power as this does as a master controller.
Yeah, I just wondered if it boosted up the power for the...
There's only a certain amount of power in these because there's only a certain size of flash capacitor in the camera.
Yeah, I understand, but I just wondered how much power the master would put out controlling.
A 580 is more reliable as a master over longer distance. That's for sure, by some distance. But if you do this, here's a case. I'm quite a long way back. I'm using a 200mm lens. You can see my flash is down on the floor in front of the model. And that's controlled by me from the camera. I just change the crop a little, just change the position a bit. And this is my result. I'm firing that flash is probably 10 meters away in daylight. Because I zoomed the head of my master flash. Actual fact, I often use a master flash on one of these off-camera cords because I can then put the flash on a stand pointed at the slave, and then wherever I turn this camera it doesn't matter and it doesn't change where this is pointing. That's a nice trick that works quite well. Okay, something quick and easy. Conference rooms. So this is an example where we had an interesting challenge. This is the room I walked into. The lights are on automatically. You can't turn them off. You open the curtains and you cover the screens, and you need to take a picture of someone using the conference system. So because this is a monitor, you have to have a shutter speed to be able to capture this. Camera goes on a tripod. And my solution was actually put a light in an umbrella pointing up. I want to fill the whole room with as much flashlight as possible because I can't knock off the fluorescent tubes. And the net result, I achieve a picture like this. So he's lit from light from above, it's nice, it just fills the room. It's a very simple one. The other one is, let's look about working outdoors. This has got two flashes in this picture. Actual fact, one either side of the model to give us some light on her. This is not cold by Norwegian standards, but in England we call it cold. It's like -5. And it's in the local forest area, and so that it looks a little bit grey in the background, and the sun's just disappearing down at about 4:30 in the afternoon. But you can see how by choosing a good ambient exposure and letting the flash work on automatic to light the model, or two flashes work, it gives me that way of balancing the natural light and the flashlight. My other thing is that this one and the next picture I'll show you is far too often I see people lighting everything. They think that they need to light all these trees in the background. Your flash is not that powerful. It won't do it. So you can creatively zoom the head in on your slave flashes. Instead of having them run them at 24mm and light everything in sight, you can see it's just in the top corner, set the slave to a very tight beam. Effectively, you've got a built-in snoot. Now, from time to time, I do use some modifiers on my flashes. What do I do with it? And I've got things like, you know, grid patterns and various snoots to go on the top to narrow them down. I mean, you can probably tell that I'm also using one of these stick-on gels modifiers, which you just hook on with Velcro over the flash. And that helps me to try and get a bit more blue in the background. I'm going to talk something about the accessories. I mentioned the off-camera cord on the end, the OCE3. I think it's a great piece of kit. Everyone should have one if you're going to do something with one flash, because that means that your one flash is now a lot more useful than just being sat on top of your hot shoe. The other thing is, those OCE3s, you can connect more than one together. So if you've got one of these, and you've got another one, because they only stretch a little bit, you've now got a bit more stretch. Okay. If you get more than about 3, it doesn't work very well. For some reason, there is something in them that makes it not work ideally.
3 works?
3 works for me. There is alternatives. Various people make longer cables. This one's 10 meters, and it still works the same as a single one. 10 meters seems to be about the limit, but there are some in the market. Yeah?
We also got something called a pocket wizard.
Can I get to the next slide? Okay. The other one which I'm a real fan of is the battery packs. The battery packs work really well with the 500 series flash guns. Gives you really fast recycling, and basically means you can shoot pretty much all day, because you've got 8 batteries in here and you've got 4 in there. Your flash will recycle pretty fast.
Is there a risk of burning the flash with too much?
The 580 Mark IIs will shut down if you use it too much. They will cut down to rather than burn the flash out. Use it on an older flash, and you can overcook the flashes. Whereas the Mark IIs, they actually they save themselves rather than burn out. Okay. So, what if you want to go without light and with radio? Pocket wizards exist. They're a fairly expensive way of taking your flash off camera, and they do work pretty much as advertised within the system. I'm not sure on local market prices, but in the UK you're still looking at about £400. One for 200 for that one and 200 for this one, and you need at least to spend that much to get one flash off camera. But they do work. It does one thing that you can't do with the Canon system, which is it will let you do second curtain sync over wireless. The Canon system won't do that, because it would have to tell the slave flash when to fire at the end of the exposure, whereas this one can do it by radio. Otherwise the Canon system would see the pulses of light during the picture. Okay, I'm pretty much done. I said I would be trying to hit an hour. So, are there any other questions? Have we confused everybody? No? Okay, well, thank you very much for your time, and thank you for putting up my particularly poor English and even worse Norwegian. I hope I haven't confused you too much, but if you do have questions afterwards, then please, I'm going to be here for a little while longer. I'm happy to talk to you individually. Thank you very much.